Hi everyone! RuneScape has a lot of unlockable abilities in the game, especially for the ranged combat style. I'll be going through each of the unlockable abilities for ranged and any other relevant ones. I would divide the ability guide by two categories, priority and accessibility. Priority being how much of a priority the ability is, and accessibility will focus on how accessible it is in obtaining it. Greater Daisy Shot and Salt the Wound. You should already be using Daisy Shot in your ability bar, so all this does is adds a small buff to it where it applies extra damage from something called Puncture. Unlocking this also lets you use Splintering Arrows. Anything that buffs something you are already using is very good. Unlocking this is super accessible too. It is unlocked using 63k Shattered Anima from Shattered Worlds. It will always be 63k Shattered Anima, or at the very least, requires Shattered Anima and not dependent on the market. Salt the Wound is not the best ability to use. Before both Last Guardian, I used to substitute it with Tendrils if I find I can't safely use Tendrils, sometimes with Bombardment too. In groups, this ability has more usage if you maintain puncture stacks, but I mostly got this with a Greater Daisy Shot, but since both of them are lumped together, the ranking remains the same for both. Demoralize and Round. These abilities do share the same cooldown with Binding Shot and Tight Bindings, and I find them inferior to Binding Shot. The only niche I find with these is that if I want to push enemies back to AoE them at elite dungeons or at Terracan to forcefully spawn the corpse carrier first. Other than that, the priority is kind of low. They are unlocked from the Scare Tactics, which is a drop from Unspeakable Horrors. You can buy them from the Grand Exchange since it's dependent on the market. I give it an okay for how cheap it is right now. Death Swiftness and Guthix's Blessing. You unlock this from the Word Awakes quest. If you don't have this, you're losing out on a lot of damage. This is the most core ability of the entire ranged combat. It costs 100% adrenaline, but it increases your damage by 50%. It's from a quest unlock too, and it will always be there for you until the end. It's less useful for Slayer, but it's still a strong ability. Guthix Blessing though, is the same as equipping a shield and using Rejuvenate or Ice Asylum, or Enhanced Excalibur. Don't ever use this. Shadow Tendrils and Ice Asylum, both unlocked from Codex Automatus, which is obtained by completing the Dig side quest. Very easy to unlock, and I totally forgot I even unlocked it when I was doing quests. It's a very powerful ability assuming you know how to use it safely without getting yourself killed like I used to do. If you're already experienced in PvM, this is a very good unlock and you probably say it is a high priority. The risk is why I give it a medium. If you got Enhanced Excalibur, Ice Asylum is not as useful. I do sometimes like to heal someone you see dying when they're doing Slayer or something. Corruption Shot. Corruption Shot can either be unlocked using the Corruption Shot ability codex for 15 Tech Eye, which is from the Liberation of Mass Camp or known as Raids, or using Mass Camp ability codex, which is pretty pricey and the price of it is pretty dynamic. Considering Raids requires up to 10 players, I give this accessibility a poor with it being a very pricey ability. Nevertheless, this is a very strong ability. It's good for AoE, which now aggroes targets at the time of recording. Even in bossing, it's a very effective damage over time ability that you should use. Greater Death Swiftness. It is unlocked using the Greater Death Swiftness ability codex, which is very expensive in the Grand Exchange, and it is unlocked from doing Zarak boss, where you get the Codex of the Lost Knowledge drop and then combine it with Siren components. To get Siren components, you also need Seren reputation in Godbow Dungeon 2 and disassemble Siren themed items for them. What it does is extends the duration of your Death Swiftness by 7.8 seconds, basically a Planted Feet perk that does the same thing but keeps some of that 10 to 20% area damage from Death Swiftness itself. In the meantime, you can get away with Planted Feet switch until this is one of the last few upgrades you need left, and that's why I give it a low priority. But if you hate Switchscape, you can probably put the priority a bit higher. Greater Ricochet. This is the most powerful ranged ability unlock in my opinion. What it does is upgrades a niche Ricochet ability into something more powerful. Only got one target? Let the two other arrows hit the same target. Got Karomi 4 perk, which increases the amount of arrows from ricochet. Now the first 2 arrows will hit for 30 to 40% damage, while the rest of them hit for 10 to 15% damage. Both powerful in building arrow stacks and 7 both the last guardian stacks. How to get it? This giant dinosaur called Raksha. Not the most beginner-friendly boss, and it also costs so much, but it's cheaper than before. Still, with how dynamic the market is, I give it a poor rating in accessibility. Double Escape. You unlock this from doing the Anachronia Agility course. It will take a very long time, but you are for sure to get it if you grind for it. You can also buy it from the Grand Exchange instead, but it's a bit pricey. Although I rarely ever use Double Escape for any boss because I either suck at it or I just find it not as useful. It also shares cooldown with Surge, so it's kinda meh. Technically that's all the ranged abilities, but let me go into other abilities that I find useful for the ranged combat style. Double Surge, same way to get it as Double Escape. Get this one first before Double Escape. Dive, complete the session questline to unlock this ability. It's always going to be there, and yes, you should get it. Also helps with just traveling around the world. It's basically Bladed Dive, but without needing the melee weapons and dealing damage. While Bladed Dive, another ability from Shattered Worlds for 63k Anima. Unless you're planning on switching a lot and using Bladed Dive for something niche like Raksha pulls, in my opinion now with Dive, this is more of a lower priority. Tusks Wrath, unlocked from 4,000 reward currency from the Anima Islands D&D. Very useful for Slayer. If I have the Dragon task, for example, and running through Elite Dungeon 2, I use it for that easy 15k damage. Highly recommended for this. In terms of using it at a boss, it's kinda less useful. Sacrifice. You can either get this from the Anima Islands D&D as previously mentioned, or get them as a drop from Godbo's Dungeon 1 foes. It's more of an utility ability than something you would use for damage. I try to use it against certain minions at Warcraft if I can for that extra healing. Devotion. Same way to unlock Sacrifice. This is a very useful ability and it's one of the core abilities that will save your life multiple times. Transfigure. Again, same way to unlock Sacrifice and Devotion, though this one is not that useful. I rarely ever need to use it because it drains 100% of my adrenaline, stuns me, and I can still die in it. I have a niche use for it at raids, but that's pretty much it. Onslaught. This ability is a wide one. I rarely ever feel the need to use it because I don't have it. Unless you're trying to do some niche strategy, I would avoid unlocking this ability unless you got nothing else to do. Also, the way to unlock it is from Liberation and Mascap, which if you were following, requires 50k Techite or that expensive Mascap ability codex. Storm Shards and Shatter. These abilities come from the Liberation of Mascap, which costs 50k Techite or the Mascap ability codex. I rarely ever use this, niche usage in groups or during some delayed mechanic, but 99% of the time, I never touch it. Diver. This is a drop from Raksha which is quite pricey to buy, but it's very useful if you can comfortably substitute it with Resonance and get that extra adrenaline instead of healing. Reprisal. This is a drop from Telos and it's quite pricey to buy from the Grand Exchange. Other than that, I find it's pretty niche for a threshold ability. You can probably use it for some niche mechanic like Unstable Black Hole from Ambassador, but I just rather use something else I know is going to damage than to risk taking that damage for extra damage. Dragon Slayer Sigil, or I guess the ability version, but I'm still calling it a Sigil, okay? Since range has access to Jazz Dragonbait arrows and using it with this is super effective, this is the most important Slayer Sigil ability to lock if you're killing a lot of dragons using ranged. For more information on what works with Jazz Dragonbait arrows with a Sigil, you can check out my arrow guide video. Only issue is that the way to obtain them isn't the easiest and it's quite pricey in the Grand Exchange. These Brazilian components come from the melee Eastern themed gear or dinosaur hide. If you're not planning to kill dragons or do Elite Dungeon 2, priority could be lowered then. Undead Slayer Sigil. Like Dragon Slayer Sigil, this one is very effective against undead enemies. One boss in particular is Warcraft where Dragon Slayer Sigil actually doesn't work there, but Jazz Dragonbait Arrow still does. If you're doing Warcraft, highly recommend this Sigil ability. Obtaining them is about the same but requires Oceanic components with a very higher price on it in the Grand Exchange. These come from Sea Singer gear and that's the only option you got for disassembling. Demon Slayer Sigil. Unlike the other two sigils, this one's the one I use the least of. It has some niche use like the demons that Zarak spawns, Abyssal Lords, or Calgarian demons, and 83 combined with Jazz Demon Bane arrows. Other than that, it's not something I find I use often in combat. I give it a low priority and obtaining it requires silent components disassembled from Death Lotus Gear, Bone Pipes, and Lankia's Spear. GE price is still pretty high on that. Ingenuity of the humans. I unlocked this back with Smoke Cloud, but with accuracy changes that's no longer needed. With bosses having more defense, this could be useful for SGB spec, for example at the Sanctum of Rebirth, or bosses where you don't have 100% accuracy. Other than that, it's more of a niche sigil ability, and with wet arrows, that's even less important in my opinion. It's quite expensive to make this or buy it from the GE. Limitless, the most expensive sigil ability, 2000 vital sparks, which is like over 800 mil. Now Limitless alone is decent. I do use it for emergency purposes, like if I didn't have enough adrenaline for defensives. I find myself maintaining Limitless for this specific purpose rather than for DPS. The problem I have with Limitless is when I bought it, I find I'm still waiting for the same cooldowns for the ability I used it for, and felt like Limitless didn't really break any PRs, especially for the cost. Although for something like Harmful Care Pack, this sigil ability is very good when the cooldown gets reset using the Time Warp ability. Focus on your other upgrades first before this because this is super expensive. As for the other sigil abilities, they are very niche that serve different purposes and I will not talk about them. I guess why I'm at it, an honorable mention because I don't see this fitting in any other videos, the Desolation curse you unlock from Praise of Codex from Next Angel of Death. With accuracy becoming even more critical, this is a very powerful prayer to unlock. I say don't think about this until you get some of the other abilities like Greater Ricochet first. And that wraps up my ability guide for ranged in 2025. If this helped you, feel free to subscribe. If you got any other ranged topics that aren't boss guides you would like me to cover, feel free to ask. Thank you for watching and bye bye.